Good morning. Welcome everyone to the University of St. Thomas Law Journal Editor-in-Chief Lecture. This year's event is Campus Speech in Uncertain Times. My name is Casey Phillips. I'm the Editor-in-Chief, and I would like to thank Professor Khan for being willing to host this event. And with that, I will hand it over to Professor Khan.
Thanks for coming out on a relatively warm, sunny day in Minnesota where you could have more fun being outside. We're going to have a nice event today. In the morning, we're going to be listening to Chris Roederer give a wonderful talk about Title IX, freedom of speech, with an emphasis on law school campuses. In the afternoon, we're going to have a more general talk about freedom of speech in college campuses in the wake of Middlebury, Charlottesville, and other similar events. What I'd like to do now is just introduce our two panelists. There's a third one who is coming, Nadine Straussen, who is hopefully en route. So Chris Roederer, who will be giving the keynote address, is a professor of law at Florida Coastal School of Law. He has authored a number of books on constitutional law and is an expert in freedom of speech and international law. Seated to his right is Frederick M. Lawrence, Secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. Secretary Lawrence has had an illustrious career at the George Washington Law School, where he was dean, and as president of Brandeis University. He's also a very accomplished scholar, teacher, an attorney, and a leading expert on civil rights, free expression, and bias crimes. I think we're going to have a great event. I'd say don't be afraid when the time comes to ask frank, honest, open questions. The goal here is to have a conversation as well as a lecture. With that, I'll turn things over to Chris.
Good morning. Or not. Well, it's really an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be here with the guests that we have. I'm a little sad, and I got a little sad when I was doing the research for this paper and this presentation. I went back and started reading a number of the things that I was reading in law school on this very topic, some by Professor Straussen herself. And I realized we haven't come that far, it doesn't seem, in terms of race relations, campus speech, gender equality. In some ways, it felt like maybe things were getting a little bit better by the time I finished law school some 25 years ago, back in 1992. So I'm a little sad about that. And of course, I got into this partly by reading the American Association of University Professors report on Title IX and free speech on law schools, not on law schools, but on college campuses. And Title IX is, federal law requiring that universities that use federal funds provide an equal education and equal educational opportunities to all their students and not discriminate against them on the basis of gender or sex. Title VI is similar with regards to race, and that schools, universities, colleges, law schools alike are not supposed to discriminate on those bases. And some of that report got me fairly upset, got me riled up a bit, talking about how students today are so coddled and how everybody wants trigger warnings and we have to focus on microaggressions and everybody's a delicate snowflake and you can't say anything anymore without there being a harassment claim or students running to the dean's suite. And I had some sympathy for that, becoming a somewhat older professor now, feeling maybe my students were too coddled and maybe free speech was being suppressed. And so when I first started off, I was very sympathetic to the report and thought free speech is under siege because of this over-enforcement of Title IX and this political correctness turned vindictive protectionism, as some have said. And so I decided to do something about it. I created a whole comedy routine filled with racial and sexist epithets to go on the road and insult people, tell them what wussies they are. I thought about delivering that speech here. I'm kidding. Actually, I didn't do any of that stuff. I'm an academic. I wrote a paper. I distributed it to a bunch of colleagues, gave it to my Title IX officer.
I don't know about them. I wanted to hear the comedy.
Yeah. I'm not Adam Carolla. It would have actually probably would have been more interesting, right, if I could pull that off. But no, I did boring things that academics do, right? And I got feedback from a lot of colleagues, a lot of friends. I researched, I read more, I thought about it more, and I came to a different set of conclusions than I first had when I started off. And part of it was all because in the back of my mind, I was thinking, you know, a lot of these problems that everybody says they're having at all these college campuses, we're not really having them that much at my law school. And that's maybe partly because we're an extra repressed for-profit law school, you know, where no one gets out of line. People don't dress up quite as nice for these things as you do. But, you know, students in suits don't do protests too much, right? We don't disinvite many speakers, although we did throw a dean candidate out. That didn't work so well for us, right? But we don't generally have the same kind of problems, and I was kind of wondering why. And I've gone through a number of different views on that, and some of them are in my paper, and I think I've changed my views from the paper as well. But part of it is that law schools are different, right? We're different from the college campus. We're different from our society at large. We put a premium on things like evidence, reasoned discussion, right? Professionalism, right? Backing up assertions with facts, not fake stuff, not a bunch of inflammatory rhetoric. We don't generally go around calling each other a bunch of horrible names, right? Because most of the time that doesn't actually go too well. The discussion doesn't go further. It generally tends to stop. Everybody gets anxious, right? And we don't do that at colleges. We don't do it at law schools, at least. We do it at colleges, I suppose. So I want to back up from that a little bit and start off with a few things that I'm sure most of you actually know. And this is another reason why I think law schools are maybe different from other places. And it's partly, should we pause?
Yeah, we should just pause to introduce Nadine Strassen, who is... Yeah, come on up. Okay.
All right, so I was about to tell you a few things that I'm sure most of you know, and I think it's one reason why law schools are a little bit different on this free speech issue. And that's partly because I think lawyers, law professors, law students aren't under the same delusion that free speech is some absolute, preeminent, most important thing that exists on campus, particularly in the law school, right? I think you're stripped of that illusion fairly early in your law school career, probably, if you thought freedom was free or something like that, or that this is America, so I can say what I want. It's actually just not quite the case, right? So I'm sure you know this, but I'm going to say a few of these things. I say the similar things to a group of fifth graders the other day, and it really bummed them out. But it was at a Catholic school, right, a Catholic grade school of a colleague of mine, and they're all, yeah, First Amendment, freedom, my rights. And I had to tell them they actually didn't have any rights because they were at a Catholic school. And those rights really didn't, I mean, there are some rights, right? They couldn't beat them and things like that very much. But otherwise, they didn't have First Amendment rights, right? So, sorry, at a private school, you don't have First Amendment rights. The students don't, the professors don't. The school might, right? University of St. Thomas School of Law might actually have some First Amendment rights and their religious rights and in their free speech rights. But you don't really. You have some free speech rights maybe, but it's by contract, not by law, not by the Constitution. You don't have rights even if you were at a public university, right? You don't have a lot of rights either, honestly. You don't have the right to be there, right? You don't necessarily have a right to say whatever you want there, right? Some of you may have wanted to get into the University of Minnesota School of Law, right? Didn't have a right to go there, don't have a right to speak there. And even if you do get there, you're invited there, you don't have a right to be invited there or to speak there necessarily, right? And so you're starting to get a little bummed out, I can see. But that's partly, this is an underlying fact, right? That, you know, schools get to invite who they want for the most part to their classes, right? Inside the class, you don't get to say what you want, right? Now, you might think there are some other things that are truisms that are important that we should know that, well, at least the government, right? The state colleges can't tell you to shut up based on their disagreement with your ideas, right? They can't have content-based discrimination against your ideas. Yeah, sorry, yeah, they can. They can a lot of the time, right? Even if you're at the University of Minnesota, guess what? Your professor can give you a D because you have really bad, dumb ideas, right? No one doubts that. Now, it may get a little more complicated when it comes to classroom discussion. No, they shut you down because, sorry, please sit down, please be quiet, right? That's not responsive to the question. You get shut down all the time, you get graded, you're evaluated based on your ideas and how those ideas comport with certain standards at the university or in your school or in your college, right? So there are such things as false ideas, bad ideas, and some of them are actually punished or sanctioned, right? You get a failing grade, you might even get kicked out. Now, some people, think that, well, we should only really limit speech restrictions on campuses. Say we're at a public university or campus. We only restrict them if they rise to the level of fighting words directly aimed at a particular person, a true threat, incitement to imminent lawless action, right? Really obscene stuff. Those are the only cases in which on a campus, we should restrict people's speech. And yes, those are content-based, but they fall into a set of very narrow categories that we think the state can limit, or the federal government can limit, as the case may be. But not just regular old hate, not even probably today group libel or, mean things in the air or racist things that we say or sexist things that we might say that are sort of in the air. But again, that's false. We actually limit a lot more than those things, and I think there's good reasons for it. And particularly when you're talking about a college campus or particularly a law school campus, there's at least 4 things that limit what you can say based actually on the content of what you're saying, mixed with the context, right? So some of it's about location, right? The classroom, nobody disagrees with me or thinks somehow that you can say whatever you want in the classroom. Professors can't say whatever they want in the classroom, right? Professors can't even do scholarship on whatever they want at their universities, right? They don't get tenure that way. Can't all of a sudden decide I'm going to do math. That's just not happening, right? So some of it's location, it's forums. Lots of parts of the school are not public forums, right? Lots of parts of the school where you have captive audiences, no one expects them to be free speech forums. Your dormitory, your classroom, maybe where you eat lunch, right? Different events, something like this, right? I'm asked to talk about free speech. I can't all of a sudden say, hey, the gun stuff lately. Let's talk about that instead, right? Probably Professor Kahn would say, we didn't really have you here to talk about guns, If you don't want to talk about free speech, maybe we can let the other two speak. They're a lot better than you anyway. Please leave, right? Perfectly legitimate disinvitation, because I'm not here to talk about guns, right? That could be an interesting talk too, but it's probably too soon or too late. I don't know, one of the three. So partly it's location, but there's a couple of other things that I'm going to mention that may be a little more controversial. One is that universities, colleges, law schools in particular have their own First Amendment rights and their own missions, their own associational rights, and they should be able to speak to those, right? And what else gets spoken and how people behave is partly in relation to the university's mission, the university's set of rights and responsibilities, right? Universities aren't public forums in that sense. They're supposed to be places where you go to learn and where knowledge is produced. And honestly, some stuff that's done on campuses just doesn't really relate to that, right? It's not really conducive to that. It's not really part of how do we have a dialogue and learn more? How do we do more research? How do we exchange ideas? Some of it has nothing really to do with that. It's really performance art, meant to incite, meant to inflame, meant to denigrate, and so on. And part of this comes with what I think is one sad thing I think about our country, right? And I think we're unique in this sense with regards to the rest of the sort of, post-industrial world. Most people throughout the world think that the idea that some race or some gender is somehow superior to other ones is just false. And there really is nothing to be gained by having a dialogue or discussion about it. Other people think, no, more speech, somehow people will figure it out. But I don't think that's so, and I don't think most of Europe thinks that's so. And sadly, our history hasn't shown that somehow the more we talk about it, the more we figure it out, that it's just a dumb, bad, stupid idea that doesn't further developments on campus, doesn't further our education, doesn't further all knowledge, doesn't make for an environment where learning takes place, right? So when people complain about, oh, these people want to be shielded from the swastika or the noose or the burning cross, that somehow they're pansies or wussies or delicate snowflakes, my own view is I don't see how that stuff's relevant to most universities' missions, much less any law school's mission that I'm aware of. And so I personally don't see that as something that's a problem from the perspective of free speech or the First Amendment. Others, I'm sure, in fact, do. So again, universities have these various missions. Law schools have very strong missions, right? You all are dressed ridiculously today on a beautiful day. You should be comfortable in your pajamas, coming to listen to something about free speech. But you're not free to do that, right? You actually have to express yourself in a way that probably some of you wish you didn't have to express yourself. You're forced into these nice little uniforms because you're being trained to be wonderful little soldiers for the law, dressed in proper uniforms so that you're polite, dignified, professional, and you step out of line that you're not doing something professional. So I don't really have a big fear that there's going to be a riot here or things thrown because you're just dressed too nice for that. Right? And that's part of why you're dressed too nice, is part of my guess, right? Because there's certain professionalism standards and ethos, and the issue of taking things seriously, right? This is a sign of, I don't usually wear a tie, I feel like I'm strangling here, right? I don't wear a tie in class. I feel free not to do that. I wear a jacket. I don't wear the vest because it's Florida, it's too hot, right? But it's a sign of, first day sometimes I do, it's a sign of respect and so on. Okay, third thing, government gets to speak, and there's lots of cases where the government speaks, whether it's the federal government or the state government speak, and they speak partly with their money, and our Supreme Court says money speaks, and money is speech, and that the government can say whatever it wants when it's speaking. It can say really, really stupid, absurd things. But it can also say things like, I'm going to give you this money, and guess what? I'm going to give you this money through Title IV, or whatever you're getting to use federal financial aid, and we're going to give you this money for your sports programs and all sorts of other stuff. But guess what? We want you to shut up about the racist stuff and the sexist stuff, because guess what? It creates a hostile environment. It makes it hard for your students to study and learn. And if you don't like that, give us the money back and do whatever you want. Right? So the government can do that. And they haven't gone that far, right? And even the Title IX stuff doesn't go that far, and the Title VI stuff doesn't go that far. It's only when it's a real hostile environment, supposedly, that they're supposed to threaten you with taking away those funds. But there's been more ridiculous cases of government funding. For instance, telling doctors and nurses what they can and cannot say to patients coming in for family planning advice. Right? You want that money? You want that federal funding? Guess what? You cannot advise your clients, say anything about their right to choose. That's off the table. Your speech is completely silent on that. I know they're coming to your office because they want medical advice, family planning advice, but guess what? You want to give them advice that runs the gamut of their rights and their health care decisions? Don't take the federal funding, right? Another example at the state level, right? Now, I'll be honest, I thought the Rust v. Sullivan funding case was ridiculous and horrible, so I'm conflicted about using it because I think it's a bad case. But I also think the Walker v. Texas case is a bad case, but I'm going to use it anyway, right? If the state of Texas can allow Oklahoma Sooner license plates and then turn around and say, but we don't want the Sons of the Confederacy to have their Confederate battle flag on our license plates, I think it follows that the University of Texas can also say, we don't want swastikas on our campus, and we don't want the Confederate flag on our campus, right? So if the state gets to speak and the state gets to decide that some things they don't want to associate with, and the Supreme Court says, you know what, you can disassociate yourself from the Confederate battle flag, I think a state university, a state law school, a private law school, and so on can disassociate themselves from the Ku Klux Klan, the Nazi Party, right? Nooses, and so on, because it has a right to say those things do not further our educational missions. They do not further knowledge. They simply distract from it. And as embarrassing and horrible as it is to have a Confederate flag on a Texas license plate, it's worse to have the Sons of the Confederacy giving speeches about how proud they are of their ancestors during the Civil War at a University of Texas speech, right? The university does not have to be compelled to associate with stuff that does not in any way further its missions to promote education, equal access to that education, and to refrain from hostile environments. All right, so I basically said the First Amendment, right, has very little room to play, properly speaking, I think, on college campuses. The last reason is secondary effects, and it kind of fits into that same set of considerations, right? And again, up until probably yesterday, I didn't like any of the secondary effects cases either, right? But secondary effects cases are when the government's really regulating the content of people's speech, but says we're not really worried about the idea, right? We're not opposed to your racist ideas. We're not opposed to your sexist ideas. We're not opposed to nude stuff. We just don't like what it does to the neighborhood, right? We just really don't want the strip club across the street from the Catholic law school. In Jacksonville, there was an infamous strip club right across the street from the Catholic high school. They finally got it to move last week, 2 weeks ago. They finally moved it up to Phillips Highway. Right? But the secondary effects doctrine is that it's not this nude dancing, it's not the message per se, it's just You know, when you got one of those things in your neighborhood, it just makes the whole neighborhood not so great. And guess what? The Nazis marching through campus kind of makes the campus not so great. Now, some people think, hey, we need to listen and we need to engage them and have some dialogue with them. But I don't really think they're there to have a dialogue in many cases, right? And so I do think if you focus on secondary effects, you might also be able to ban a lot of this speech on campus. Now, what people have generally resorted to is saying, well, the secondary effects is safety, right? That, in other words, we're disinviting these various speakers because of our concerns about safety. And we really don't want to spend another $500,000 to protect Mr. Spencer when he comes to campus and everybody riots, right? We don't want to spend another $500,000 to protect Milo Yiannopoulos when he comes to campus and does his comedy performance art routine, right? Well, that doesn't sound like a really good reason because the university has all sorts of resources for security, and so they suspect it's just because they don't like the content. And it's true, they don't like the content. But I would suggest that maybe that's because the content really isn't worth protecting in that sense, because this isn't a public forum, right? It's a university, it's a college, right? Why don't law schools have these problems? We don't invite Milo Yiannopoulos to law school. No one invites him to law school, right? Adam Carolla got disinvited. Oh, so sad, right? We don't invite Adam Carolla to law school to speak, right? So we don't have these problems because no one in their right mind would think that that's an appropriate speaker to invite to the law school because they don't really add anything, right? Or if they add something, it's at the margins and the light is just not worth the candle, right? Now you might think that's horrible, it's government suppressing speech. But I actually don't think it's the government suppressing speech. I think it's an educational institution that's making critical value judgments about what kind of speech helps further their mission and what kind of speech detracts from it, causes a lot of noise, causes a lot of disruption, causes a lot of pain and suffering, and so on, right? So that's on one hand, right? That's just the invited speakers, free speech stuff, which I think, for the most part, is sort of overblown, right? I don't think there's huge free speech problem when Milo Yiannopoulos doesn't get to come on and do his, homophobic, sexist, racist routine or whatever it is. I just don't feel the pain and the loss, and our free speech, values are all undermined. He gets his message out just fine. There's lots of public spaces for him to stand on the sidewalk and speak. He has his Twitter account, so they got suspended, but right, he gets to speak at the national convention, right? The Republicans, oh yeah, they suspended him too. But all those were private folks suspending his speech. The Republicans cut him off, right? Twitter cut him off. But somehow it's a problem that the public university says, sorry, we don't want someone who justifies pedophilia giving a speech on campus because of the content, right? It wasn't obscene content, wasn't fighting words, sort of, because it wasn't directed necessarily at a specific individual. But some people thought that's problematic, right? Put up a video on it and everything else. So what about some of the other things in the Title IX report? Right? What about our coddled students and the fact that they have to have safe spaces and they don't want to hear of all the horrible things? And it's true, we've become completely polarized, right? We shut things out if we don't like what people are saying. We turn them off, we shout them down, we drown them out, we escort them out the door, and so on, right? Students run to the principal or to the dean's suite anytime someone says something mildly offensive. We have to give trigger warnings now, and people are all worried about microaggressions and all these other things. Well, again, I think the rhetoric on it is a bit overblown, right? On the one hand, yes, I think some students are spoiled these days. Everybody gets a little award, right? Everybody gets something for showing up. And that's maybe troubling. It's troubling to see in your statistics how happy your students are. Right? There's something wrong with the law school when the students are so happy. Right? I picked up the brochure. I'm like, what's going on here? right? Happiest students, and that makes no sense to me. You got no reason to be. Maybe it's the suits make you happy, right? But I think law schools can handle most of these things that people think are problematic, right? Law schools have been about managing people's expectations from the beginning. We do get lots of students who come in that are completely underprepared. They don't want to be challenged, you know, but I think for the most part, law professors still challenge their students. You manage probably to somehow be happy despite that, right? But you can challenge students and you can engage them without having to resort to, you know, abuse and treating them horribly or telling them they're all delicate snowflakes or saying no safe spaces, right? I mean, I think a lot of our rhetoric is just inflammatory on both sides, right? You're a racist, you're a sexist, you're a delicate snowflake, right? That just, for me, doesn't move the ball forward. And we don't honestly have that many conversations in my law school, at least, and I don't think in most law schools, right? I think we can give people trigger warnings. I do it in almost every class. I say, hey, you know, I'm going to talk about a bunch of stuff that's maybe going to upset you, and I'm a particularly offensive person sometimes, and I try to do the South Park equally offensive thing to everybody, but I'm sure that just means a lot of people are offended, and I hope not to do that, and I hope people can talk to me about it. Sometimes people go to the deans on me, but usually things escalate when someone doesn't respond in a professional way to someone else saying, I thought that was kind of unprofessional, and I thought you were, you know, saying something that racist, or why didn't you call someone else out for being racist? Usually we can take care of most of that stuff, right? All these little problems by simply engaging our brains and engaging in dialogue and being sensitive a little bit without being too awfully coddling. The last thing I'll say perhaps is on the sort of microaggression idea. And I think from one perspective, it's true that people get maybe a little bit oversensitive and any little thing becomes a microaggression. Back when I was in law school, again, 25 years ago, I sat in a seminar where Professor Peggy Davis was writing her article on micro-racism, right? Today's microaggressions, right? Now, of course, just because there's lots of microaggressions doesn't mean there's a microaggressor, right? Perhaps the term's mislabeled. But there are people who suffer multitudes of little indignities every single day, just in the language that we often use, which is often uncareful, inconsiderate, and so on. That doesn't mean you're an aggressor, it doesn't mean you're a horrible person, but it also doesn't mean that the person who's hearing those words isn't hurt, isn't offended, and that they don't pile up. In fact, they do often pile up. They're little straws that end up breaking camel's backs at some point. Now, the reaction to it isn't to label someone who does a microaggressive thing as some kind of horrible, you know, person that's been an aggressor, an abuser, right? I mean, of course, that's an overreaction. But it's also an underreaction for a college or university to say, oh, we're just going to ignore all those little microaggressions. That's your itty-bitty little thing. That's your problem, right? That's your little mole that you're making into a mountain. And I don't think that's appropriate either. And I think that universities have an obligation to actually step in, right? When they identify microaggressions, micro harms, how they step in is a different question, right? But some people say, oh, you only want to step in when you have a student or a perpetrator or a professor or someone who intends to incite imminent unlawful conduct or intends to actually harass or intimidate or threaten that particular student, right? The example of the noose with the banana for the poor woman who is at the American University, first African-American student president, right? Those were direct threats against her. Of course, those are horrible. But you can have those kind of threats in the air, right? You can have the nooses around campus that aren't directed at that particular person. You can have the nooses around bananas all over campus that aren't directed at a particular person. And while those are not the true threat to that person, they do undermine the dignity of the university. They undermine the learning environment. They make it harder for some students to concentrate and study and to have an equal access to the American dream. And so I don't think the university has to wait until you have the sort of microaggression become a serious attack in the form of a threat or fighting words or incitement before they act. And I think for the most part on law school campuses, we take action much earlier. A lot of it's teaching moments. A lot of it's more discussion, conversation, right? It doesn't mean you have to be expelled, doesn't mean your whole life's ruined, but it also doesn't mean that you shouldn't do anything, right? And so I think I'll maybe end there, because I probably have talked too much. You might be ready to take a nap. And I'll let other people join in or respond.
All right, that was a fantastic talk. And again, now I'll introduce Nadine Strassen, who is what I'd like to do is make a few comments about Chris's talk and his paper, and then we'll open up the discussion to the rest of the panel and the entire group. Now, some of this will focus a little bit on things in the paper where Chris talked a little bit more about particularly student culture and law student culture, but I'll also respond to the conversation. First, I think this is a marvelous paper. In particular, it reminds me of what Gary Trudeau said in the aftermath of the Danish cartoons, that what you choose to run isn't a question of censorship, it's editing, and to the extent a school is a private institution, they have the ability to regulate what they want to have on campus. I thought an especially interesting direction that Chris went in his paper and talk was the notion that university has a mission. The mission is to educate. There are certain types of speech acts that are low value speech, the way Felix Frankfurter would have put it. It's that the speech in question, you know, having the banana with the noose doesn't advance anything, and therefore the school has the freedom to choose not to have that particular noose with the banana. They have the freedom to actually make statements that it's a negative thing to have that. Now, the fact that the university or school has the freedom to do it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the right thing to do in every instance. And here I'd want to draw a distinction and kind of take a step back from a question of the First Amendment protections of speech, which is a legal question, versus questions about freedom of speech and censorship, which are political in nature. There may be, and here think about the University of Chicago letter that was sent out earlier this year that talks about we have no safe spaces here. We want to have a universe where people have exposure to all types of ideas, and if you're not ready to stand up to it, you know, you can exit through the nice gates with the ivy growing over them. And I think that one of the things that I'm interested in looking at is what's led to this universe where university administration might think that a noose is okay, or where there are concerns about people of different groups mingling on campus. And here I'd emphasize a little bit questions of polarization on campuses And I guess because the way, and Chris described it well, there's this kind of South Park view of college campuses where Cartman sings about his safe space, and they chase reality around and eventually capture reality, who's dressed in purple. And this is a sense of coddled students. Everybody gets a trophy. There's a sense that this causes students harm themselves. That's Lukianoff and Haight's point. I'm not a huge fan of that type of framing. To me, I kind of view our situation somewhat differently. So some of the people that Chris cites in the article talk about helicopter parenting and helicopter professoring, where people have hovered over students so much that they're not able to deal with the noose and the banana. I kind of view this more as a question of the rise of the internet, social media, and big data, which enters into this in two ways. First, one of the things about you as a generation is that, all right, I went to college in the 1980s. If I don't see the noose or the banana on campus, I don't see anything. I mean, maybe I see things in my family, maybe in my neighborhood. If they take the noose or the banana off the college campus, it's still on social media, it's still on Facebook, it's still on Twitter. Some of the effort, so here really misses the boat. I also think one of the things about the shift is we've seen the emergence of big data. We can measure things the way we never have been able to before. And this has created a culture of compliance. So instead of helicopter parenting or helicopter professoring, we have helicopter governing, which is one of the ways to think about parts of Title IX. And here I want to leave the parts of Title IX that talk about sexual assault to one side. The government regulation of campus speech can create a certain type of chilling effect. And I think that type of argument isn't that controversial. But there's a second element here that I think is a little less obvious. We talk a lot about coddling children in the trophy generation. Everybody gets a trophy. But I don't think we're in the trophy generation at all. I think we're in the no child left behind generation, where the trophy is called being able to go into the next grade. And we set up a universe where nobody can fail, everybody teaches to the test, and you have zero tolerance. And these messages, which I think come from the ability to use data to identify information and to regulate information, creates a universe where we try to apply the same thing to speech. The same zero tolerance we have about students doing poorly in class or bullying in high schools or junior high schools, we also apply to college campus speech. I think the results here can be somewhat pernicious. I think one of the things about things like Middlebury, where Charles Murray comes to speak, is that, you know, I don't like racism, I don't like sexism, homophobia, all those things. If I try to root out every last speaker, I'm going to get exhausted. When I get exhausted, I'm more likely to make mistakes. I'm more likely to say something I didn't mean at the heat of the moment. And I think the greater flow of information facilitates this. The final point just about big data. and how it kind of influences the nature of students is one of the things that Chris Roederer talks about at the end of his paper is the student as consumerist, and that law students have a consumerist attitude towards choosing law schools, life in law school, responding to teaching. It goes into a certain sense in which the student is seen as, weak and what the student needs to put up with. And I actually think here big data also plays a role in influencing our life and how we think about schools and speech acts. As I was going home from a conference in Chicago last week and taking the subway, I saw a sign that said, "Let Alexa buy your next fridge." And if Alexa can buy your next fridge, why can't Alexa buy your next law school? If we have these data points and we can actually regulate everything, I think it helps to generate a culture that isn't so much about coddling as if we have a hammer, we have this data that we're gathering, and now everything is a nail. So we can actually have like mandatory reporting under Title IX to make sure that we have every single possible data point about whether an individual school is or isn't complying with free speech directives. And I think that micromanagement is hopefully something that people who take a variety of positions on campus culture, right versus left, can agree on. And I guess I'll stop there and throw it to Secretary Lawrence and Nadine Strawson.
Well, thank you both. Let me start with a story. Some years ago, I was a visiting scholar at University College London, and I was giving a talk about where what I would call protected hate speech turns into punishable hate crimes. A member of the faculty, charcoal gray suit, much like some that I see here, and an English accent I shall not attempt to imitate, says, suppose that a group of skinheads took a van and painted it up with racist slogans and drove it right into the heart of Brixton. Brixton is a neighborhood of London, and at the time, still to a large extent, primarily African British and Caribbean British population. They drove it right into the heart of Brixton. Wouldn't you be comfortable with that being prohibited, punished? So I started to talk about how I would analyze that, which I will share with you in a moment, and he stops me in the middle and says, "Why is this so hard for you? We all know it's wrong. Why can't we just punish it?" Well, I guess, Chris, it's not quite so hard for you, but it is hard for me. And I think there are reasons that it ought to be hard for us, because that very expression, "we all know it's wrong," I believe is meant to ring tin in the American ear. We should be very careful when we say, "we all know it's wrong." Because "we all know it's wrong" starts with Richard Spencer and then goes seamlessly to Milo Yiannopoulos. And so far, if we're voting, do we think it's right or it's wrong? I'm still pretty comfortable voting that it's wrong. And then we start to move across the spectrum, and it's Charles Murray, and people are starting to get a little more queasy about saying "we all know it's wrong." And it's not just that one would be exhausted if one tried to root them all out, and therefore one makes mistakes. It's one just might make mistakes from this whole enterprise of trying to root this out. Beware the heresy chasers, because the day that they are chasing a heresy that you want them to chase today, they may be chasing a different heresy tomorrow. So Chris is certainly right to bring us back to first principles of universities, and I think that's particularly helpful because it keeps us fresh in mind that for purposes of this discussion, which I take to be instrumentally about the First Amendment, but not fundamentally about the First Amendment. What I mean by that is that the First Amendment and the protections of free expression are instrumental to what it is universities do, and they are significant rights for other issues in society that we could be talking about. But today we're talking about what happens on campus. And I think the fundamental issue, right, is what is the mission of the university? And it is terribly important for all universities to clarify that mission. Another story, this one goes back even a little further. Dwight Eisenhower, before he was president, when he was Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe during the Second World War, was a genius of strategy and the articulation of tactics to articulate strategy and to enforce and execute on strategy. And then at the very top of that pyramid, mission. What's the mission? And he kept a card on his desk during the Second World War, throughout the war. And the mission, anybody want to guess what the mission was? Win the war. And he said he got an enormous clarity of vision from refracting hard questions through the lens of win the war. How is this helping me win the war, not win the war? Now, when I've said this to my faculty colleagues or trustees at Brandeis when I was president, or my board of advisors at GW Law School, they would all sort of smile and nod, much as many of you are doing right now. This seems like a nice story about Eisenhower. But of course, the punchline is, okay, folks, what's our version of win the war? Because we better have one, and we better be able to articulate it. So I'll tell you mine. It is the creation and discovery of knowledge and the transmission of that knowledge through our teaching and our scholarship for the betterment of our local, national, and even international communities. So all hard questions have to be refracted through that lens, and that will not give you a simple answer. This is not about saying, and here are the answers to all these questions, but I do think it is about articulating what the questions are. So how does that help us coming back to the free expression phase? And for this purpose now, I'm less concerned about public or private universities. We can talk about First Amendment doctrine and how specific cases in the First Amendment context make a difference. But I think for our purposes, whether you articulate it from First Amendment built up and say that applies to state universities, or principles of what a liberal arts education is supposed to be about, and build that up from first principles of educational philosophy, you get to very similar places about enforcing that mission and supporting that mission of a university. It seems to me that it is essential for the execution of that mission that there be the broadest possible protection of free expression. It is so tempting to start talking about which speech is of a high value, which is of a low value, and to say, hey, didn't you say creation and discovery of knowledge? Well, what that guy says, that's not knowledge, that's nonsense. Yeah, well, that's the danger. Right? Galileo was nonsense once upon a time. Now, do I think Milo Yiannopoulos is Galileo? No. Do I want to live in a world where he is considered Galileo? No. But I also know that it is extremely dangerous to start down the road of certainly a government, and in certain purposes and with certain limitations that I'll come to, for the university to play that role of what's good knowledge and what's bad knowledge. So are there no limitations then on what a university should or can do with respect to speech? Well, everything that I've laid out so far I would call a threshold question of that which is permissible and ought to be permitted on campus. I think you're clearly right that Milo Yiannopoulos seems not to be invited to law schools, and probably for perfectly good reasons. And by the way, when he is invited certain places, the real answer is that people tend not to show up. I mean, in some ways, the best example of what happened at Berkeley, and yes, it cost a lot of money, which I'll turn back to in a moment, but the real punchline is that most of those kids at Berkeley, they were on their way to biochemistry. They weren't worried about stopping in Sproul Plaza to listen to Milo Yiannopoulos. So the new chancellor at Cal Berkeley properly said that Yiannopoulos' visit to Sproul Plaza at Cal Berkeley was the most expensive photo op in the history of education. Now, the fact that it cost a couple $100,000 for that photo op is something we have to give some thought to in a moment. But that's the real answer. Nobody came to see him, not that he was precluded from coming. So you're probably right, nobody has invited him, but the question really is, what if some group did? Or what if you go sort of one half notch above Milo Yiannopoulos to someone like a Ben Shapiro? Suppose that a conservative group on campus wanted to invite him. I think I can make a pretty cogent argument as to why it is not worth listening to Ben Shapiro. And I think you should not listen to that argument if the question is whether or not he should come to campus. I hope you would listen to that argument if the question is what happens when Lawrence gets a chance to debate Shapiro. then I hope you will listen. In fact, I hope I'll persuade you. But not for the point of view of keeping them outside the door. Context is what is going to be critical for so many of these issues where we start to put limitations. So what is it that happened at American University? American University, first African-American woman elected president of their student body. And the next day, bananas with the initial of an African-American sorority with nooses around them show up around campus. I think that is almost certainly an unmistakable signal of a particular threat at a particular student. And the question I would ask is not, is that a valuable contribution to the discussion? No, of course I don't think it's a valuable contribution. But as I just said, I think that's a dangerous road to start down. So what is the proper way to think about that? Well, what was the goal of those actors who put those bananas up? Was it to add to the discussion of relations on campus in a particularly provocative way? Is that inconceivable? No, it's not inconceivable, but I think it turns out not to be true. How are you going to know what's in people's minds? Well, folks, have you all had criminal law already? We do that all the time. And of course, it is hard to draw lines, but as my wonderful late mentor, constitutional law professor Charles Black, in a Texas accent that I probably will fall into, because when I think about Charlie Black, I can't help but hear it in his voice. He would say, the fact that lines are hard to draw does not free us from the obligation from having to draw them. Of course, we do it all the time. What is it that distinguishes murder from manslaughter, from criminally negligent homicide, to no liability whatsoever? The physical act can be the same. It's what was in the mind of the actor. When I've done a version of this lecture to third, fourth, and fifth graders, apparently we all work the primary school group too, although I must admit I did this when my kids were that age. I have to warn you, I don't think you've thought about this yet, but when you become lawyers, you have lawyers' kids for kids. It's an occupational hazard. So when we would talk about, Daddy, what did you do at work today? And I tell them, probably a terrible thing. I tell them what we covered in criminal law that day. So we actually did criminal law hypotheticals around the dinner table. I told you this is dangerous stuff. There's still time to go back for all of you. So I did a version of that in primary school. And actually, all kidding aside, I would start by asking the kids, give me a rule. I don't care what the rule is. Just give me a rule. And then we'll work from that and actually tease out basic principles of attempt versus completion of different states of mind. Turns out the moral intuition of a smart, committed fifth grader is sort of unvarnished moral intuition. They're not old enough yet to self-censor, but they're old enough to actually have a pretty advanced moral intuition. It actually maps onto Anglo-American jurisprudence in a pretty startling way. So I'd give them an example of somebody takes a bat, hits somebody else in the head very hard, big welt on the head, causing physical damage and knocks the person unconscious. What crime has been committed? And you go around the room and people say murder, attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, etc., until one person finally asks the important question, which is, you haven't told us enough facts yet. Who's the person with the bat? Who's the person who got hit? If the person with the bat is the batter and the person who got hit was the catcher standing too close to him, then this whole thing is different. And it's not just different because of culpability. I would make the further point that it's different about the actual harm to the victim based on the culpability of the actor. That is to say, the welt is the same, the unconsciousness is the same, the physical manifestations is the same, but the sense of attack is completely different. Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, even a dog knows the difference between being tripped over and being kicked. How much more so us? And we know the difference between being attacked and having our views hurt. So, for example, a burning cross always is an attempt to intimidate somebody on the basis of race. No. It could be. It often is. And those cases ought to be prosecuted as hate crimes. Or it could be the conclusion of a Klan rally, where it is the expression of white supremacist views, views that I find abhorrent, to be sure, but it is an effort to express. And I think that line, that mens rea-based analysis, maps onto what we would want in the free expression space much better than looking at what the effect might have been on an individual. context is everything. Last point on this. It is clear that free expression, which, as I've just said, is critical to the whole academic mission, imposes a cost on the society. If people are presumed to be free to express their views with limitations, way out on the horizon, true threats and the like, but by and large free to express themselves, we're going to bump into each other a lot. People's feelings are going to get hurt. People are going to be upset. More than that, people are going to feel devalued, delegitimized. That means free expression has a cost. I believe it is a cost worth bearing for all of the reasons I just described, but I also believe that it is a cost that does not fall equally across all elements of society. And that is also about context. What is it about the fact that when a group of white supremacists walk through Charlottesville, Virginia, and shout, "Jews will not replace us," I will candidly tell you I did not feel attacked. I did not feel threatened. I felt disgusted. I felt mortified. But given my context, my life, I did not feel threatened. Would my grandparents have felt threatened? I bet they would have. And suppose it wasn't Charlottesville. Suppose it was Nuremberg in 1935. Well, that's different too, isn't it? So we have to be sensitive to context, and that becomes then the job of the university president or provost or dean, and on some level, friends, all of us, to respond not by repressing speech, but by weighing in to show that there is certain speech that ought to be protected that is inconsistent with the highest values of our society. Not because people aren't allowed to criticize them. Go back to my British friend. If we all know it's wrong, then we ought to say that. We ought to articulate that. We ought to say it forcefully. Because the real goal is the day comes when the Milo Yiannopoulos show up and nobody's there. For the time being, if it costs money, A, that may be money that has to be found, and B, that may give rise to arguments for time, place, and manner regulations on speech that say certain kinds of speech is going to have to be done through a forum like this with closed circuit and live feed, because we're not going to come up with $500,000 every time somebody wants to come to campus. Again, different from keeping people outside. I think if you start with first principles, we're about the creation and discovery of knowledge. We should be protecting that knowledge as broadly as possible, and then finding other ways of building the kind of communities that we want to build. Because at the end of the day, a learned hand gave his famous Spirit of Liberty lecture during the middle of the Second World War. And he said the spirit of liberty ultimately dwells in the breasts of men and women, not in any constitution, in any written document. As long as it is there, the society is free. And if it's not there, it doesn't matter a great deal what is in any document. Thank you.
Good morning. I had to look at the clock to see what time of day it was. This is a really nice surprise because I knew I was speaking in the afternoon, but I didn't know you expected me to speak this morning. But I'm happy to chime in. I just didn't want to repeat what I'm going to be saying this afternoon, so I'll try to think of a few other points. I didn't mean to be rude when I said I had to send a very important email. Specifically, I have just finished proofreading the first proofs of my book that's very relevant to this topic, and I wanted to send it to the editor at Oxford University Press to forward the production process. And the book is called Hate, all caps, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. So you understand that's directly relevant here. And I read and enjoyed Chris's article. I heard most, I think, of his talk. I'm not sure exactly what time it started. I agree with many points that he made, specifically describing the law, but I think with Fred, I have a slightly different orientation that stems not only from First Amendment principles, but also from general principles of academic freedom and freedom of speech. And let me say this. I, for many years, was the president of the American Civil Liberties Union, which is called the American Civil Liberties Union, not the American Constitutional Law Union. The organization believes, and I personally believe, that all individuals are entitled to certain fundamental freedoms, no matter who they are, no matter what they believe. And when we can use the Constitution as a tool to protect those fundamental freedoms, we do. When we can't use the Constitution, we look for other sources of law, such as the best known would be the anti-discrimination civil rights laws. Until you were law students, you probably were amazed to learn that there's no constitutional prohibition against discrimination on the basis of race, sex, gender, and so forth. So here on a private campus, a religious campus, I would say that because of fundamental pedagogical goals, fundamental academic goals, professional goals in terms of training you to become the most effective and ethical lawyers possible, that a robust protection of freedom of speech serves all of those goals very well. I will also say that in addition to the academic freedom and pedagogical reasons, the other reason why I fundamentally support First Amendment principles is that they coincide with strategic and policy concerns. Going back to Fred's example, and we, the Nazis, unfortunately, are not only historic reminders. We're now seeing neo-Nazis in Charlottesville and other places. It's a topic that's very searing to my personal history. My father was born what was called a half-Jew in Berlin in 1922. That meant that his father was Aryan, his mother was Jewish. Interestingly enough, as Fred knows, under Jewish law, that meant he was not Jewish, but under the Nuremberg laws, he was. So sort of the worst of both worlds. Yes, I know, but in those days. So, but he was anti-Hitler, and he was under the Nuremberg laws considered to be Jewish enough that he ended up being put into the Buchenwald forced labor camp and almost died there, and in fact was scheduled to be sterilized literally one day after he ended up being liberated by the American military. So I literally owe my life to the U.S. military. I love speaking to military audiences. I do it all the time because we are defending the same fundamental freedoms in different ways. And I say that much as I love freedom of speech, I loathe the Nazis even more. And if I believed that the best way to avoid another rise of fascism or Nazism here was to censor them, I would do it. But guess what? It's not. They had censorship in Nazi Germany. And Hitler and his henchmen used it the same way Milo, and I don't mean to say Milo was like Hitler in other ways, but in strategically taking advantage of efforts to censor. So Weimar Germany, the Weimar Republic was in power during which Hitler rose to power, had very strict anti-hate speech laws, which made it a crime to engage in anti-Semitic speech. The leading Jewish organizations, there was a robust Jewish community in Germany, they monitored these trials, and they said that most of them were handled effectively. There were prison sentences that were meted out, including repeatedly. Julius Streicher, the publisher of Die Stürmer, a virulently anti-Semitic rag, was repeatedly sentenced to prison. And the Nazis loved it because it was a platform for them to expound their views, to gain public attention, to gain sympathy. And unfortunately, that playbook is being followed, and I think liberals and, well-meaning liberals are being played by the Milos and the Ann Coulters of this world. They love nothing more than to have confrontation. And confrontation can be either in the form of attempted censorship and the resulting battles, or it can be in the form of confrontational counter-protests with Antifa and so forth. An organization that I respect enormously, which along with the Anti-Defamation League has done probably more than any other to monitor hate groups and hate crimes, is the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they put out a guide this summer for college students who are interested in responding to and hopefully countering the recruitment, frighteningly increasing recruitment efforts by white supremacists on college campuses. So the SPLC puts out this guide on what are constructive steps you can do. And first and foremost, they start with it, they end with it, they stress it in the middle. First and foremost, do not confront them. It feels morally justified to try to censor them. It feels morally justified to try to shut them down, shut them out. But that is going to do more harm than good. Please resist that temptation. And constructively, they give examples such as, go to the student group that invited them. It's possible they don't realize what a negative impact this group is going to have. So you can try to dissuade them. Work with other groups that might feel especially vulnerable in facing this visit to campus. For example, minority student groups, build coalitions, and have your own affirmative event, but don't make it a in-the-face counter-protest. Have it at a different location. Make it a positive, affirmative celebration of diversity and inclusivity and equality, everything that they are fighting against, that you are standing for. So, even if there weren't First Amendment principles at stake, wearing my professor hat, wearing my lawyer and law professor hat in terms of training my students to be the best professionals they can be, and even putting those hats aside as a practical political operative, an activist, I would say, for all of those reasons are independently sufficient reasons for not allowing more repression of speech than U.S. law happens to allow. Now, the reason I say than U.S. law happens to allow, as a result of writing my book, I became even more steeped than ever in the nuances of the U.S. law in this area. And as I keep telling my students, the more you can never study it too much. You can read the same decision 100 times, 200 times, and you always see something new in it. And it's really exciting to develop just an ever-increasing appreciation of not only where our law is, but how it got there and what were the consequences when it was different from what it is. Here's a very interesting fact, which I don't think you mentioned, Chris. This is not, because a lot I'm not saying because you covered so much of the law so very effectively. But, for all of the differences on the current Supreme Court, and you know how fragmented they are, right? 5-4 is like kind of a landslide. It's often 4-4-1 or 3-3 to 2-1. They're very fractured, but on these fundamental First Amendment questions about whether controversial, hateful, hated, hate speech and other loathsome speech should be protected, they're almost always unanimous across an incredibly ideologically diverse spectrum, right? From far left to far right. And that's kind of interesting because it also dovetails with the fact that the robust free speech principles that they are supporting has also defended and protected views that are completely across the ideological spectrum, from a flag burner who tends to be on the left end of the political spectrum to a cross burner who tends to be on the right end of the political spectrum. The Supreme Court has very strongly supported freedom of speech for both of them, because what is at stake is a principle that is absolutely critical, not only to individual liberty, but also to equality and also to our democratic republic. That is, if we allow the government or a university or any other power, and this is a topic I think we haven't gotten into yet, a major online superpower, which is wielding a lot of censorial authority lately, whoever it is, if we cede to them the determination of which speech should be suppressed because of anything short of a directly caused, specific, imminent, serious harm, anything short of that is licensing that source of power to simply pick and choose on the basis of which ideas it disfavors. And not surprisingly, throughout history and around the world today, because many developed democracies do allow government to punish hate speech, hated ideas, and not surprisingly, it is the dissenting ideas that are disproportionately targeted, the unpopular ideas, and very ironically, because these laws are often instituted with the goal of protecting racial and religious and other minorities, often it is members of those very minority groups whose speech is disproportionately censored. Here on a religious campus, I should mention that in Europe and Canada, Australia, other similar democratic countries that outlaw hate speech, religious Christian speech has been very, very heavily targeted, including ministers and priests who are preaching from the Bible, including even in places of worship. And you can guess why, because certain biblical passages that are deeply part of their beliefs and written into their holy books. By the way, same thing happens to imams reading from the Quran or preaching from the Quran. Some of those religious teachings are viewed as being discriminatory on the basis of sexual orientation or gender. And therefore, even religious preaching has been punished criminally as hate speech. Criminal sentences have been meted out and prison terms have been served. I mean, these are ideas that are not as popular with the secular powers that be in those societies. In the United States, before we adopted the speech protective standards that Chris laid out, which not coincidentally were adopted during the civil rights movement, right? It's hard for us to comprehend this, but in those days, in those places, speech by Martin Luther King and other pro-civil rights demonstrators was seen, it was hated. It was even seen as hateful. It was certainly seen as dangerous and threatening security and stability and life as we knew it and cherished it. And that's why Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. That's why so many of the great free speech decisions, which were issued by the Warren Court landmark decisions in the 1960s, all involved civil rights demonstrators, attempted civil rights marches, speeches, gatherings. So, this idea that we can't have a heckler's veto, that nobody should be allowed to suppress speech because they dislike the idea and they're shouting the speaker down, those principles arose from hecklers in southern towns who'd be lining the parade routes of the civil rights demonstrators, and sometimes even armed with rocks and stones and bottles. Sound familiar, right? And the southern towns said, well, in order to maintain law and order, we have to shut down the demonstration. And the Supreme Court said, no. What you have to maintain law and order, you have to arrest those would-be hecklers. You have to allow the demonstrations to go forward. So it just hand in glove with the advocacy of racial equality was the defense of equality in the field of ideas, even for ideas that were then seen as hateful and subversive. And before that, abolitionist speech was censored, and certainly advocacy of women's rights. And I even remember as recently as the 80s, there were serious efforts to censor speech advocating LGBT rights. So before we adopted what I call the emergency principle, that you can only censor speech when necessary to avert an imminent, specific, serious harm, such as a true threat, intentional incitement, a targeted harassment, or bullying. Before that, we had something called the bad tendency test, and that's basically what you have under any looser standard. And I think I heard Chris saying this, that, if we get beyond the targeted threat of the nooses that were clearly aimed at Taylor Dumpson herself, and there's kind of a general threat in the air, that's a little bit in the direction of the bad tendency, right? That it might lead to a negative idea, which might lead to a negative act, which might be really bad. And so we've got to nip it in the bud. Obviously, there is a grain of truth and a grain, more than a grain of concern there. But the point proves too much. It's why Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, every idea is an incitement, right? By that, he didn't mean, therefore, you can censor any idea. He meant exactly the opposite. The fact that it could potentially incite something negative is not enough of a justification to censor it. And he was, along with Brandeis, were forerunners of what was ultimately adopted by the majority in the 60s. But under the bad tendency test, I was thinking about this in response to something that both Chris and Fred said. Justice Brandeis famously said, fear alone cannot justify censorship. Men feared witches and burned women. Feared witches and burned women. And that brings me to the topic, the specific topic that we're talking about, Title IX on campus. And here I think I've spoken more than enough, so I'll just make one brief point, which is I think from my perspective as an advocate of freedom of speech and equality, including women's equality, I've been a lifelong feminist and proud of it. I am very disturbed about the extremely overblown concept of definition of sexual harassment that had been adopted under Title IX, and which is being advocated on many campuses, is now being reconsidered, and I'm glad of that, because it encompassed essentially any expression about sex or gender that made anyone subjectively uncomfortable or that was unwelcome to anybody, as opposed to the very demanding test that appropriately demanding test that the Supreme Court had set out, which was that there had to be an objective standard and that the expression had to be both objectively offensive and persistent and pervasive and severe. All of those had to be satisfied because there was such a high threshold for protecting expression. And the Supreme Court said that in a case that happened to involve a secondary school in a college campus, the standard of protecting speech should be at least as high, right? And then you look at examples of how the looser standard has been enforced, and the one that's the best known, but it's a really sad example is the Laura Kipnis situation, a professor at Northwestern University, lifelong feminist, film theorist, among other things, and an article she wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Education in which, among other things, she complained about the overblown concept of sexual harassment. She was reported on charges of sexual harassment for having written that article. She was subject to what she described in another Chronicle of Higher Education article as my Title IX Inquisition, and the resulting uproar finally led the university to drop the investigation against her. But the university, understandably, because of the pressure from the Obama administration and its understanding, I'd say misunderstanding of Title IX, was that once a complaint has been made, that you have to investigate it. So I think, we often go through course corrections. We swing too far in one direction, and there was a long time in our history where we didn't even acknowledge the concept and the reality of sexual harassment and that it is a violation of equality. And then the pendulum swung too far, and the concept of sexual harassment was so expansive that it basically, as I said, touched even on any expression about sex or gender. And so hopefully now we're going to course correct where we are drawing one of those difficult but essential lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine. I will give Chris an opportunity to respond.
So yeah, just a few points. It's true that a dog generally knows the difference between when it's being kicked and when it's being tripped over. But I think that assumes a dog that's relatively well taken care of most of the time. If you, however, have a dog that seems to be always kicked or feels like it's always being kicked, it starts having a hard time distinguishing when it's being tripped over and when it's being kicked. And so I say that as sort of a way into a few other points, that sometimes it's one thing, right, to intend good things. I'll give you an example. When I went to law school, I came from the University of Kansas. I was well known to be one of the nicest, sweetest, genuine persons. I had a passion for justice. Really, really great guy. I got to New York and started dating a woman, and everything I said was wrong, right? Racist, sexist, stupid things that a redneck, I came from a working class family in Kansas, right? You kind of expect it, and I was so, how can she, I didn't intend any of these things. I didn't intend to be sexist, I didn't intend to be racist, I didn't intend to be insensitive, but I was continuously, right? Now, she was overly sensitive. She was way overly sensitive. But, and I went into therapy. I highly recommend it if you're in law school and you haven't been to therapy yet. I started going to therapy because of it, because I thought I was crazy, because, our two worlds were just so different. But she genuinely felt hurt at half of the things that came out of my mouth. And I didn't intend, I really honestly did not intend any of it. And I felt, this sort of political correctness on me, and how could anybody question, But the fact is, we often do things that hurt people when we don't mean to or intend to. And certain members of our society feel them much differently. Almost nothing offends me. Almost nothing hurts my feelings. Swastikas, nooses, bananas, you can, anything, right? Because I come from a fairly, privileged background in the sense of, feeling those feelings of discrimination. But I do think it's different for other members of the community. And part of the problem and sort of the background to Title IX is that, you see it, we have a president who, bragged about sexually harassing, assaulting women, right? It's everywhere now. Everybody's coming out to tell their stories now. And the problem on college campuses when the Obama administration began was that, campuses were not looking into sexual harassment stuff. They were avoiding it. They were covering it up. You know, it was embarrassment. You know, it coincides a little bit with a lot of the church scandal stuff, you know, and, you know, people would talk to the professors, and the professors say, well, do you really want to go any further with this? The university doesn't want to go any further with it because it's an embarrassment and it's bad for everybody. And so part of what happened with Title IX is then when they started trying to enforce it a little bit more, and they found some universities that were not in compliance, they didn't take away their funding, but they entered into an agreement, settlement agreements. And those settlement agreements included what we'd call prophylactic measures that went beyond the requirements of Title IX. It's like, okay, nobody's investigating this stuff. Guess what? Every professor now has to be a mandatory reporter. Yeah. Anybody mentions anything about anything related that could be some kind of harassment, the professor has to report it. I mean, that goes way too far. But that's what happened in those settlement agreements based on particular universities basically turning a blind eye to it. Well, then what happens when other university lawyers get a hold of these settlement agreements? They're like, oh, look what they're being required to do under the new settlement agreement. Well, maybe if we want to avoid being in trouble, we got to do everything they're doing in the prophylactic agreements, right? So everybody starts going above and beyond. And then it catches a momentum, right? Whereas, you know, women were silenced, women weren't listened to, their complaints were not heard. Then we start moving towards, okay, we're going to, you know, it's the gray area is messy, right? Gray area is messy. You know, preponderance of evidence is messy. You know, establishing a higher standard's easier. It lets you sort of say, well, you didn't meet this higher burden of proof. They started moving to a preponderance standard where it's 50-50 in terms of the evidence. But then the argument was that routinely that mixed with a lot of other procedures meant that, you know, if you were accused, you were guilty. Right? So again, a problem, like you say, was swinging in the other direction.
Can I interject something, Chris? Because that's an amazing coincidence. Yesterday, my law school had its mandatory sexual abuse under Title IX training. And I was saving my voice for this. I've been fighting laryngitis, so I didn't speak up, but I was really developing a lot of steam because the trainers used the word victim and survivor. There was no acknowledgement that of any kind of due process rights on the part of the person accused. And I don't care if 99.99% of people who are making accusations are telling the truth. For that 0.0001%, I want us to have our minds open to it. But the rhetoric of the training it's not just a presumption of guilt, it's a conclusion of guilt. And then I also saw my well-meaning faculty colleagues just tied in knots. Wait, you're telling us, because they brought in a psychologist who said, well, the first thing you have to do is to validate the student and show that you're willing to listen. Oh, but wait, you have to tell them that you're not allowed to listen because it's a mandatory reporting obligation. And how do you walk that line? So, I mean, all these good intentions, but a lot of problems.
But see, I think law professors and law schools can deal with those a little better maybe than universities can in terms of pushing back and requiring better due process. And, you know, yeah, I mean, it's a hard line. I mean, oftentimes it's who gets to the deans first, honestly, in my experience. But it's true, you know, in some ways it's gone too far, and there's a lot of things that people need to guard against. But I think you don't want to swing back to saying, you know, we don't want to hear your complaints. We don't want any, you know, I just think things like there'll be no safe spaces just sends the wrong message. Or accusing anybody who's a victim now of being, you know, a delicate snowflake or something like that also is the wrong message. And I think for the most part, law schools are very well equipped to not resort to that. It's either, you know, either the women are all making it up, or, you know, the guys are all innocent, or the guys are all completely evil. And of course it's women too. I mean, we've had, you know, the domestic assaults and things like that are not only men, although a preponderance, sadly still are men, but
when I shifted from being a law school dean to a university president, one of the questions I got asked a lot, what's the biggest difference, biggest transition, besides the fact you have athletic teams when you're running a university, which that's another story for another time. And it turns out you get parents when you're a university president. And as a law school dean, parents seem to be someplace else. As a university president, I assure you they were there. But seriously, one of the biggest cultural differences, and you're just at the beginning of this, but from the time I entered law school to the time I left George Washington University Law School as dean, I had spent a big chunk of my life almost entirely with lawyers, law professors, and those trained in the law. There's a shared vocabulary. There's a way in which we think about things, even when we disagree. There's a kind of argument, that I would make out of passion, where Chris would say, "Yeah, well, that one's out of bounds. That wasn't a logical argument." I'd say, "You're right," because we have, it's like we're playing chess, and in the middle of the chess game, I can't take out a baseball and throw it at the king. That doesn't count. We have predetermined what the rules of the game are, broadly defined. When you move out of the law faculty, that tends to be less shared. And I think that is one of the challenges in universities, and it is clearly about the road to hell being paved with good intentions. Because very few of these cases are people who have gotten up in the morning and say, today's the day I'm going to really ruin the university. Right? They're all trying to accomplish a good goal. And I think, as you properly say, it's about worrying about a time that we can certainly remember when women who were victims of sexual harassment knew perfectly well they were supposed to keep it to themselves. They were supposed to be ashamed. There was nobody they could talk to. And that was sort of deeply ingrained in the system. I remember a trustee of mine, when we talked about Title IX issues, saying to me, when did this all start, this sexual assault business on campus? And I said to him, "Oh, as best we can tell, it started in 2003. I said, "Are you kidding?" When you were here in the late 50s, early 60s, you honestly think that there was not unconsented sexual contact and sometimes unconsented sexual intercourse, which is called rape, taking place on this campus? It's just that women knew they weren't allowed to talk about it. So that was an awful state of affairs. So obviously the pendulum had to move, but we're in that business now of watching it move, and we're in a world of social media, 24/7 cycles, and 140 character thinking, which is not well equipped to having pendulum move in a sensitive and careful way.
Can I say one last thing about the Southern Poverty Law Centers? That website, by the way, is fantastic, and the things they coach you on in terms of what to do if you have people coming to campus who you don't feel maybe should be there, or you don't like their views. And it's an interesting point you made, and a point that they make about not engaging them, right? And I think, and I've heard this in people discussing the free speech on campus stuff, and whether or not there's a lot of people that actually think the counter-protest is engaging in speech, and that the protesters are engaging in speech. Now, in a lot of these cases, neither one is really engaging in speech in the sense that a lot of people would like to see. They're not actually having a discussion, right? Even the people marching in Charlottesville, they weren't talking about the monuments, oddly enough. There wasn't a discussion about the monuments, which ostensibly is what the march was about. And the counter-protesters weren't talking about the monuments, right? And so the Southern Poverty Law Center is saying, disengage, because you're not having a conversation there, right? Now, part of my point is that I don't know that you need to allow folks on campus to march with tiki torches and, and shout the things that they were shouting to begin with. In other words, I'm not sure that you should engage with them in terms of giving them a platform on the college campus. Maybe somewhere else, but I'm not sure that the college campus needs to give them the platform to begin with. But then secondly, I'm not sure anybody obviously should show up for that and engage with it, because it's not the kind of case where more speech, at least not more speech of that kind, right? And I think that's the important distinction. So your book on more speech to combat hate is not what a lot of people think of speech nowadays. They think speech is the kind of things that our president says, the kind of things that people say, like, to get attention, to try to be as inflammatory as possible. And I'm not sure that's really the kind of speech that moves things forward.
Actually, to move from that to the time, place, and manner side of things, we've run a little bit past the end. We've run a little bit past the deadline for this panel, so we'll adjourn and have a lunch where we can continue our conversations or non-engaging speech acts, and then come back at 1:30 for round 2. But let's give a final round of applause to the speakers.